Before we begin, look at this flower. Picture it growing in a field somewhere, Afghanistan perhaps, or Tasmania, or even in a hidden corner of someone's garden. Its petals are delicate, almost translucent, purple and white, sometimes red, sometimes pale pink. When the wind moves through a poppy field, the flowers sway like silk banners. Beautiful, innocent, serene. For 5,000 years, human beings looked at this flower and saw a gift. They called it medicine. They called it mercy. In ancient Mesopotamia, they called it whole gill, the joy plant. They believed it was the hand of God reaching down to ease suffering, to grant sleep to the tormented, to open doorways to the divine. Today, this same flower kills more than 200 Americans every single day. Over 1 million people have died in the United States alone since 1999. Mothers, fathers, children, veterans, honor students, construction workers, nurses. Their deaths were not inevitable acts of nature. They were not random tragedies. They were the result of choices made by corporations, governments, and empires who saw in this ancient flower not a medicine, but a weapon, a tool for profit, a means of control. This is not a story about weak-willed addicts who made bad decisions. This is a story about how a 5,000-year partnership between humanity and a plant was twisted into the deadliest drug crisis in modern history. It is a story about greed, about betrayal, about wars fought over sap and powder, about pharmaceutical executives who became billionaires while bodies piled up in emergency rooms. Before we go further, I need to ask something of you. If you're finding value in this, if you believe these stories matter, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And in the comments, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. It helps me know who's listening, who's seeking these histories in the quiet hours. Now, phone away, distraction silenced, settle in. We're going to travel back through time, back to Sumerian temples where priests harvested divine sleep, to the opium wars that shattered China, to Victorian laboratories where chemists thought they were creating miracles, to the boardrooms of Purdue Pharma where executives engineered an epidemic, and finally to the present moment where synthetic opioids flood the streets and the dying has not stopped. The flower never changed. Its chemistry remained constant across millennia. We changed. We weaponized it. We commodified it. We built empires on it and destroyed communities with it. Let me tell you about the flower that conquered the world. In the beginning, 5,000 years ago, the Sumerians called it whole gill, the joy plant. In the beginning, there was the flower. Long before empires, before written law, before the great temples rose from the Mesopotamian plains, there was a plant with delicate petals, white, pink, deep purple, and a secret hidden in its unripe seed pod. The Sumerians, those first urban people who invented writing itself, gave it a name that echoes across 5,000 years, whole gill, the joy plant, the plant of joy. This was 3400 BCE. The world was unimaginably different. No anesthesia, no antibiotics, no understanding of infection or disease. Pain was not an inconvenience. It was a constant companion, a fact of existence as unavoidable as hunger or thirst. Surgery meant constant agony. Childbirth was a dice roll with death. Injury, even minor, could mean weeks of suffering. In this context, the discovery of the opium poppy was not recreational. It was salvation. The process was delicate, almost ritualistic. Farmers learned to score the unripe seed pod with a blade, not too deep, not too shallow, and wait. The plant would weep. A thick, milky white latex would seep from the wound, beating on the surface. The sap would be carefully collected, then left to dry in the sun. As it oxidized, it darkened, first to amber, then to deep brown. What remained was opium, concentrated, potent, divine. The Sumerians understood what they had found. This was not simply medicine. This was a gift from the gods themselves. It erased pain. It granted visions. It allowed the dying to pass peacefully, and the wounded to sleep without screaming. It was mercy in solid form. As centuries passed and civilizations rose along the Nile, the knowledge traveled with them. By 1500 BCE, the Egyptians had codified their medical wisdom in the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest preserved medical texts in human history. Among its more than 700 remedies, opium appears again and again, for pain, for sleeplessness, for calming crying children, for easing.
The passage of the dying. The Egyptians grew their poppies in Thebes, and Thebacum, opium from Thebes, became the most prized variety in the ancient world. When Greek physicians inherited this knowledge, they studied it with systematic precision. Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine, prescribed opium for pain and for diarrhea. Galen, whose writings would dominate European medicine for over 1,000 years, documented its uses in exhaustive detail. For surgery, for terminal illness, for unbearable suffering, opium was the only answer they had, the only effective answer anyone had. But here is what matters. There was no crisis, no epidemic of addiction, no social collapse. Why? Because context controlled use. Opium was rare. It was expensive. It required cultivation, harvesting, preparation. It was administered by healers, priests, physicians, those who understood its power and its dangers. It was used sparingly, ceremonially, with reverence. It was not recreation. It was not escape. It was medicine in a world that desperately needed it. Picture, if you will, a woman in labor in ancient Sumer, given a preparation of opium to ease the impossible pain of bringing life into the world. Picture a soldier in ancient Greece, his legs shattered in battle, granted sleep while the physicians set the bone. Picture a dying elder, surrounded by family, slipping peacefully into the next world rather than screaming through the night. This was the gift of whole gill. This was the flower's first story. Not corruption, not vice, not the hollow pursuit of pleasure. Simply relief, simply mercy, simply the ability to endure what would otherwise be unendurable. For thousands of years, across dozens of civilizations, the relationship between humanity and the opium poppy was one of respect. The plant was a tool, powerful, dangerous if misused, but fundamentally medical, fundamentally sacred. The ancient world understood this balance. They lived with it. They honored it. But the world was changing. Trade routes were expanding, technologies were advancing, and the flower, in its quiet way, was about to travel far beyond the temples and medical halls where it had been kept safe. As the Silk Roads opened and empires rose, the flower traveled east. It arrived in China quietly, carried by Arab traders in the 7th century, tucked among bolts of silk and crates of spices. At first, it was simply medicine, another remedy in the vast Chinese pharmacopoeia, prescribed for pain and dysentery, respected but unremarkable. For nearly 1,000 years, this remained the relationship: medicinal, controlled, safe. Then, in the 17th century, someone discovered a new method of consumption. Not eating opium, not drinking it dissolved in wine or tea, smoking it. The innovation was simple but transformative. Mix opium with tobacco, heat it over a flame, inhale the vapor through a long pipe. The effect was immediate, powerful, and profoundly different from oral consumption. The high was faster, more intense, more euphoric, and far, far more addictive. Within decades, recreational opium smoking spread through China like wildfire. By the 1700s, millions were addicted. Opium dens proliferated in every major city, dim rooms filled with smoke, lined with wooden platforms where users would recline for hours, pipe in hand, lost in dreams. Productivity collapsed, families disintegrated. Silver, the currency of the Chinese economy, began flowing out of the country at an alarming rate, paid to foreign merchants for more opium. The Emperor of China recognized the crisis. Opium was banned again and again, but bans meant nothing when there was profit to be made. And the British East India Company saw extraordinary profit. Here's how the system worked. Britain was obsessed with Chinese tea. The British drank it by the ton, an addiction of its own kind. But China would only accept payment in silver, and Britain's silver reserves were draining. The trade imbalance was unsustainable. Britain needed something to sell to China, something the Chinese would buy in vast quantities. Opium was the answer. The British controlled India. In the fertile regions of Bengal and Bihar, the company forced Indian farmers to grow opium poppies instead of food crops. The opium was processed, packed into chests, each containing roughly 140 pounds of the drug, and smuggled into China by the tens of thousands.
Chinese merchants paid by British traders distributed it throughout the country. The silver flowed back to Britain, the tea flowed to London, and millions of Chinese descended into addiction. This was not accidental. This was not an unintended consequence. This was deliberate economic warfare using addiction as a weapon. By 1839, the Emperor of China had had enough. He appointed Commissioner Lin Zexu, a respected official, to end the opium crisis once and for all. Lin was uncompromising. He confronted the British merchants in Canton, demanding they surrender their opium. When they refused, he
blockaded them in their warehouses until they complied. In June of 1839, Lin oversaw the destruction of more than 20,000 chests of British opium, over 2.6 million pounds of the drug, dissolved in lime and seawater and flushed into the ocean. Britain's response was swift and brutal. They declared war, not to protect innocent merchants, not to defend national honor, to protect the drug trade. This is not interpretation. This is documented fact. The British government went to war with China to force that nation to accept the opium that was destroying it. The First Opium War lasted from 1839 to 1842. It was not a war between equals. Britain had modern warships, rifled artillery, disciplined infantry. China had junks, outdated cannons, and an army unprepared for industrialized warfare. British ships sailed up Chinese rivers, bombarding cities, blockading ports. The Chinese fought desperately, but they were outmatched at every turn. In 1842, China capitulated. The Treaty of Nanking was signed aboard a British warship. The terms were humiliating. China was forced to pay massive reparations, open 5 ports to British trade, and cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain in perpetuity. And opium, though not explicitly mentioned in the treaty, continued to flow freely. But it wasn't over. In 1856, Britain, now joined by France, launched the Second Opium War. The pretext was minor: a ship boarded, a flag torn down. The result was another crushing defeat for China. Beijing itself was occupied. The Summer Palace, a complex of breathtaking beauty that had taken generations to build, was looted and burned to the ground by British and French troops. China was forced to legalize opium completely, to open even more ports, to accept foreign ambassadors in the capital. Opium flooded China without restriction. By the early 1900s, an estimated 25% of adult Chinese men were addicted. Entire generations were lost to the drug. The social and economic devastation was incalculable. This is empire at its ugliest. Not conquest for land, not war for ideology, but the deliberate, systematic destruction of a civilization through forced addiction, carried out for profit. The British Empire, at its height of its power, chose to build its wealth on the bodies of Chinese opium addicts. The flower had traveled far from the Sumerian tablets and the Greek medical texts. It had become something else entirely, not medicine, not sacrament, a weapon. While China drowned in smoke, Western doctors were creating something new. In 1804, a young German pharmacist named Friedrich Turner made a discovery that would change medicine and human suffering forever. Working in his small laboratory in Paderborn, Germany, Turner managed to isolate the active ingredient from raw opium. What he extracted was a white crystalline powder, pure and potent. He called it morphine, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. This was revolutionary. Morphine was approximately 10 times stronger than raw opium. More importantly, it was consistent. A doctor could measure an exact dose, predict its effects, control the treatment. For the first time in human history, pain could be managed with scientific precision. Then came the hypodermic syringe. In the 1850s, the invention of the hollow needle and injectable syringe created another breakthrough. Morphine could now be delivered directly into the bloodstream. The effect was immediate, powerful, and profound. For patients enduring surgery without anesthesia, for those dying slowly of cancer or tuberculosis, morphine was nothing short of miraculous. It was mercy in crystalline form. But the true test came with war. The American Civil War, which raged from 1861 to 1865, was the first modern industrialized conflict. It was also the first war where morphine was used extensively in battlefield medicine. Wounded soldiers, and there were hundreds of thousands of them, shattered by many balls and artillery shells, were given morphine freely. Field hospitals distributed it without hesitation. It saved countless lives,
allowed surgeries that would have been impossible, eased unimaginable suffering. But when the war ended and the soldiers returned home, many brought an unexpected companion with them: addiction. Estimates vary, but historians believe that over 400,000 Civil War veterans became dependent on morphine. The condition was so common it earned a name: soldier's disease. These men had survived the war, only to find themselves trapped in a different kind of battle, one fought in their own bodies against a substance they could not live without. The medical community recognized the problem. Morphine caused addiction. It caused nausea, severe constipation, respiratory depression. Patients built tolerance, requiring higher and higher doses to achieve the same effect. The search began for an alternative, something with morphine's pain-relieving properties but without its dangers. In 1874, an English chemist named C.R. Alder Wright,
working at St. Mary's Hospital in London, synthesized a new compound. He took morphine and modified it chemically, adding 2 acetyl groups to the molecule. The result was diacetylmorphine, a substance that would later become infamous under a different name. For over 2 decades, Wright's creation gathered dust. Then, in 1898, the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company in Germany rediscovered it. They tested it extensively and were thrilled by the results. It was more potent than morphine, it worked faster, and crucially, initial studies suggested it was non-addictive. Bayer gave it a brand name, HEROIN, derived from the German word heroic, meaning heroic or powerful. They marketed it aggressively. Heroin was sold as a cough suppressant, particularly effective for tuberculosis patients whose lungs were ravaged by disease. It was advertised as a safe treatment for bronchitis, asthma, even the common cold. Most remarkably, it was promoted as a cure for morphine addiction, a non-addictive substance that could wean patients off the more dangerous drug. For over a decade, heroin was available over the counter. You could buy it at your local pharmacy. It appeared in Sears catalogs right alongside household goods. It was in medicine cabinets across America and Europe. Mothers gave it to children with coughs. Doctors prescribed it freely. Medical journals praised its effectiveness. The reality became clear slowly, then all at once. Heroin was not non-addictive. It was catastrophically addictive. It was far more addictive than morphine, far more dangerous, far more destructive. Users developed dependence within days. Withdrawal was agonizing. Overdose was easy. By the 1910s, the heroin addiction crisis had exploded, dwarfing the morphine problem it was supposed to solve. In 1924, the United States passed the Heroin Act, banning the manufacture, importation, and use of heroin completely. It was removed from pharmacies, outlawed in medicine, driven underground. The pattern was now established. A natural substance, opium, was refined into something stronger, morphine. Morphine caused problems, so chemists created something supposedly better, heroin. Each iteration was more potent, more dangerous, more addictive. Each solution created a worse crisis. The road to catastrophe, paved with good intentions and scientific confidence. The flower that had been a gift had become a molecule, and the molecule had become a curse. As America banned heroin, the underworld saw opportunity. Prohibition does not eliminate demand. It simply transfers the trade from legal businesses to criminal enterprises. When heroin was outlawed in 1924, the market did not disappear. It went underground, and what emerged in the shadows was a criminal infrastructure so sophisticated, so profitable, and so deeply entrenched that it persists to this day. The root was elegant in its simplicity. Turkish farmers grew opium poppies in the highlands of Anatolia, where the climate was perfect and cultivation had continued for centuries. The raw opium was smuggled across the Mediterranean to the port city of Marseille in southern France. There, in clandestine laboratories hidden in warehouses and basements, Corsican gangsters, men who had perfected the art of organized crime during World War II, transformed the opium into pure heroin. From Marseille, the heroin was concealed in shipments of legitimate goods and transported across the Atlantic to New York, where Italian-American mafia families controlled distribution. This network became known as the French Connection. It was ruthlessly efficient. The Corsican gangsters ran the labs with professional precision. The Italian mafia, led by figures like Charles Lucky Luciano, who operated from his exile in Sicily after being deported from the United States, organized the American side of the operation.
Money flowed back through the same channels. For decades, from the 1930s through the early 1970s, this pipeline supplied the vast majority of heroin consumed in the United States. Then the story moved east. During the Vietnam War, another source of heroin emerged from the mountains of Southeast Asia. The Golden Triangle, the remote, heavily forested region where Burma, Laos, and Thailand meet, had grown opium poppies for generations. Local warlords controlled vast territories where poppies grew in terraced fields. As the war escalated and the CIA conducted covert operations throughout the region, accusations surfaced that the agency's airline, Air America, was being used to transport heroin. Whether through active participation or willful ignorance, the result was the same. By the late 1960s, the Golden Triangle was producing an estimated 70% of the world's heroin supply. American soldiers in Vietnam had access to heroin that was cheap, pure, and everywhere. Many used it to escape the horror of the war, to numb themselves to what they were experiencing and what they were being asked to do. Studies conducted after the war suggested
that approximately 15% of American servicemen returned home with heroin addictions. These were young men, many still teenagers, who had served their country and come back with a dependency they had not asked for and could not escape. Back in the United States, heroin flooded into inner cities. The epidemic hit predominantly black neighborhoods with devastating force. This was not accidental geography. These were communities already marginalized, economically abandoned, over-policed yet underprotected. Heroin devastated families, fueled crime, destroyed potential. The human cost was immeasurable. In 1971, President Richard Nixon stood before the American public and declared drug abuse public enemy number one. He announced a war on drugs, framing addiction as a criminal justice issue rather than a public health crisis. In 1973, he created the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, to coordinate federal efforts against narcotics trafficking. But the war did not stop the flow. It could not. The economics were too powerful. The profit margins on heroin were staggering. A kilogram that cost a few $1,000s in the Golden Triangle could be cut, diluted, and sold on American streets for hundreds of thousands. That kind of money creates empires. When enforcement cracked down on the French Connection, when arrests were made, labs were raided, and the Marseille pipeline was finally dismantled in the early 1970s, the trade did not stop. It adapted. Mexican cartels expanded their operations, growing poppies in the Sierra Madre Mountains and refining heroin closer to the American border. Asian gangs organized their own distribution networks. The black market was too lucrative, too deeply embedded to be eliminated by enforcement alone. What Nixon's war created was not the end of heroin trafficking. It was the expansion and militarization of it. Cartels became more violent, more sophisticated, more entrenched. Prisons filled with low-level dealers and users, while the kingpins remained largely untouched. The prohibition that was meant to protect society instead created a permanent criminal class, a forever war with no clear victory condition and an ever-mounting body count. The flower that had been a gift, then a medicine, then a molecule, had now become an empire, a shadow empire, built on addiction and enforced with violence, operating in every major city, generating billions of dollars, and proving nearly impossible to dismantle. By the 1980s, heroin seemed like yesterday's problem. Then came something worse. Or rather, something that seemed worse, something that captured media attention and political hysteria in a way heroin never had. Crack cocaine exploded onto the American scene in the mid-1980s, cheap and devastating, and suddenly that was all anyone could talk about. News broadcasts showed images of crack houses, of users consumed by paranoia, of urban neighborhoods ravaged by violence. Politicians declared a new war, passed mandatory minimum sentences, militarized police forces. The nation was gripped by moral panic. And while America was transfixed by crack, heroin quietly continued its work. It never disappeared. In fact, it became cheaper and more available than ever before. Mexican cartels had perfected the production of black tar heroin, a crude but potent form that could be manufactured quickly and smuggled efficiently across the border. Colombian cartels, already masters of the cocaine trade, diversified into heroin production, growing poppies in remote mountain regions. The supply was steady, the price dropped, and the drug metastasized through America's cities. But there was no media coverage, no primetime specials, no presidential speeches.
because heroin, by the 1990s, had become stigmatized as an inner-city problem. It was associated overwhelmingly with Black and Latino users, with neighborhoods already abandoned by investment and opportunity. Policymakers focused on crack. Heroin users were left to suffer and die without attention, without resources, without the urgency that might have saved them. The disparity was not accidental. It reflected exactly who the nation considered worth saving. While heroin ravaged communities in silence, something else was happening, something quieter, more respectable, unfolding in corporate boardrooms and pharmaceutical laboratories. In 1984, Purdue Pharma was purchased by members of the Sackler family, who would transform it into one of the most profitable and destructive pharmaceutical companies in American history. Throughout the 1990s, pharmaceutical companies invested heavily in synthetic opioids, oxycodone, hydrocodone, and others. These were not new substances, but the delivery systems were being refined, the formulations improved, the marketing strategies perfected. In 1996, Purdue Pharma launched OxyContin. It was a time-release formulation of oxycodone, designed to provide 12 hours of pain relief from a single pill. The company marketed
it aggressively, sending sales representatives to doctors across the country. They distributed promotional materials claiming that the risk of addiction was less than 1%. They held conferences, sponsored continuing education programs, offered incentives for prescriptions. The message was clear and consistent. OxyContin was safe. It was effective. It was appropriate for routine pain management. These claims were lies. OxyContin was prescribed for everything: back pain, dental surgery, sports injuries. Conditions that previously would have been treated with over-the-counter medications or physical therapy were now being addressed with a powerful opioid. Doctors, trusting the pharmaceutical industry and incentivized by sales representatives, wrote prescriptions by the millions. And for the first time, the face of opioid addiction began to change. The new users were not inner-city residents. They were white. They were suburban and rural. They were middle class. They were people who had never sought out drugs, who would never have considered themselves at risk. They received prescriptions from trusted physicians, filled them at respectable pharmacies, took them as directed, and they became addicted. The pills were in medicine cabinets across America, in households that had never encountered addiction, in communities that had looked away when heroin ravaged other neighborhoods. The crisis was no longer something that happened to other people in other places. It was everywhere. The fuse had been lit. What Purdue unleashed would become the deadliest drug crisis in American history. What Purdue unleashed would become the deadliest drug crisis in American history. This is not hyperbole. This is not activist rhetoric. This is documented fact, supported by internal company documents, federal investigations, and a body count that continues to rise. What happened between 1996 and the present day represents one of the most calculated, profitable, and devastating acts of corporate malfeasance in modern history. Purdue Pharma did not simply sell a product. They engineered an epidemic. The marketing campaign was unprecedented in its scope and aggression. Sales representatives, hundreds of them deployed across the country, were given clear targets: increase prescriptions. They were paid bonuses tied directly to the volume of OxyContin prescribed by doctors in their territories. The higher the dose, the larger the bonus. They focused particularly on high-prescribing physicians, those who saw large numbers of patients and were willing to write scripts quickly. The sales pitch was consistent. OxyContin was safe. The risk of addiction was less than 1%. It was appropriate for moderate to severe pain of any kind. The time-release formula meant patients would not experience the highs and lows associated with other opioids, reducing abuse potential. These claims were presented in glossy brochures, in sponsored medical conferences, in peer-reviewed journals where Purdue paid for favorable articles. These claims were lies. But the lies were reinforced by a broader cultural shift that Purdue helped orchestrate. In the late 1990s, medical organizations began promoting the concept of pain as the fifth vital sign, alongside blood pressure, heart rate, temperature, and respiration. The idea was compassionate on its surface. Pain should be taken seriously, assessed consistently, treated aggressively. But in practice, it created immense pressure on physicians to prescribe opioids for any reported pain, regardless of severity or appropriateness. Doctors who had been trained to use opioids sparingly, primarily for cancer and end-of-life care, suddenly found themselves expected to prescribe them routinely. A patient recovering from wisdom tooth extraction would receive a 30-day supply of OxyContin. Someone with chronic back pain would get 90 pills at a time.
High school athletes with sports injuries would be sent home with bottles of powerful opioids, and the prescriptions were written by the millions. In some regions, the situation metastasized into something far worse than well-meaning doctors misled by pharmaceutical marketing. Pill mills began appearing, particularly in Florida, Ohio, and West Virginia. Storefront clinics where doctors would write prescriptions for cash, no questions asked, no examination required. Patients would travel hundreds of miles, line up outside these clinics before dawn, pay $200 or $300, and walk out with prescriptions for 180 pills or more. These were not rogue operations hidden from view. They were obvious, brazen, sometimes advertised. In some Florida counties, the number of opioid prescriptions exceeded the entire population. One doctor in Florida wrote more than 100 OxyContin prescriptions per day, every day, for years. The money was staggering. The human cost was incalculable. And here is what made OxyContin particularly devastating. The time-release
mechanism could be defeated easily. Crush the pill, and the entire 12-hour dose was released at once. Users could snort the powder or dissolve it and inject it, producing an immediate, intense high, comparable to heroin. What Purdue had marketed as a safer, abuse-deterrent formulation became one of the most sought-after drugs on the black market. By 2012, doctors in the United States were writing 190 million opioid prescriptions annually. That is enough for every American adult to have their own bottle. Millions became addicted, not through recreational experimentation, not through moral failing, but through prescriptions written by trusted physicians for legitimate pain. Then the prescriptions stopped, not because the addiction ended, but because the scrutiny began. States implemented prescription monitoring programs. The DEA began investigating high-prescribing doctors. Pill mills were raided and shut down. Patients who had been taking opioids for years, who had developed profound physical dependence, suddenly found themselves cut off. But the addiction remained, and heroin was waiting. On the street, heroin cost a fraction of black market pills. It was more available, easier to obtain, and often more potent. The transition was almost inevitable. Studies would later show that approximately 80% of heroin users started with prescription opioids. The pills had been the gateway, and when that door closed, another opened. Throughout all of this, Purdue Pharma knew. Internal documents, revealed years later through litigation, show that the company tracked problem prescribers, doctors who were writing suspicious volumes of prescriptions, who were clearly running pill mills. Purdue did not report them to authorities. They did not cut off supply. In many cases, they increased it, because those high-volume prescribers were extraordinarily profitable. The company knew that OxyContin was being abused. They received reports of addiction, of overdoses, of deaths. They continued marketing it as safe and non-addictive. In 2007, Purdue Pharma and 3 of its executives pleaded guilty to federal charges of misbranding OxyContin by claiming it was less addictive and less subject to abuse than other opioids. The company paid a fine of $600 million. Not a single executive went to prison. The penalties were treated as a cost of doing business. And the Sackler family, which owned Purdue, had already begun extracting their fortune. Over the years, they pulled more than $10 billion out of the company, funneling it into offshore accounts, trusts, and shell corporations, insulating their personal wealth from future liability. They continued to live in luxury, lavish homes, art collections, philanthropic donations that put their names on museum wings and university buildings, while the bodies piled up. This was not an accident. This was not an unforeseen consequence of a well-intentioned product. This was a calculated campaign to maximize profit by creating and sustaining addiction, even when the human cost became undeniable. The documents prove it. The numbers prove it. The graveyards prove it. The flower that the Sumerians had called the joy plant had traveled through 5,000 years of human history. It had been medicine, weapon, empire, molecule. Now it was a product, and the product had been engineered to create dependence. The crisis was no longer about a substance. It was about a system designed to profit from suffering. As pills disappeared, the streets filled with something far more deadly. The prescription crackdown that began in the early 2010s was, on paper, a necessary intervention. States implemented prescription monitoring programs. The DEA raided pill mills and arrested high-volume prescribers. Pharmacies faced new restrictions on dispensing opioids. Doctors, terrified of losing their licenses or facing prosecution, began cutting off patients who had been on opioids for years. But the addiction did not disappear with the prescriptions. Millions of Americans were already dependent.
Their bodies required opioids to function, to avoid the agony of withdrawal, the sweating, the shaking, the bone-deep pain, the inability to sleep or eat or think. When their doctors cut them off, when the pill mills closed, when the pharmacy stopped filling their scripts, they did not simply recover. They sought alternatives. And the Mexican cartels were ready. They had been watching the American opioid crisis unfold with keen interest. They understood the market dynamics perfectly: massive demand, constrained legal supply, opportunity for profit. The cartels increased heroin production dramatically, particularly in the Sierra Madre Mountains where poppies grew easily and enforcement was minimal. They refined their product, increasing purity to levels rarely seen before, and they dropped the price. By the mid-2010s, a bag of heroin, enough for one dose, cost between $5 and $10 on the street. A single
OxyContin pill on the black market cost $80 or more. The economic calculus was brutal and simple. A person addicted to opioids, cut off prescriptions, and unable to afford black market pills could get the same effect from heroin for a fraction of the cost. The transition was predictable, and it was catastrophic. Heroin flooded into communities that had never encountered it before: suburbs, small towns, rural areas in Appalachia, in New England, in the Midwest. Places where heroin had been an abstraction, something that happened in distant cities to other kinds of people. Now it was in high school parking lots, in church bathrooms, in the bedrooms of middle-class homes. The demographics shifted dramatically. In the 1980s, during the crack epidemic, approximately 90% of those arrested for heroin offenses were non-white. By the 2010s, approximately 90% of new heroin users were white. The epidemic had changed location and changed face. It was no longer confined to inner cities. It was everywhere. The victims were high school athletes who got hooked after sports injuries, honor students who started with pills after wisdom tooth extraction, parents in their 40s and 50s who had taken opioids for chronic back pain, people with jobs, families, futures, until the drug consumed everything. The death toll mounted with terrifying speed. In 2010, approximately 16,000 Americans died from opioid overdoses. By 2017, that number had risen to more than 70,000 total opioid deaths annually, with heroin accounting for a substantial portion. That is more Americans dead from overdoses in a single year than died in the entire Vietnam War, more than car accidents, more than gun violence. And suddenly, the media paid attention. The coverage was strikingly different from how crack had been covered in the 1980s. The language changed. These were not addicts. These were victims. This was not a crime problem. This was a public health crisis. These users did not need prison. They needed treatment, compassion, intervention. The victims were described as our sons and daughters, as promising young people whose lives had been derailed by disease. Newspapers ran photo essays of beautiful suburban teenagers, athletes in their uniforms, smiling before the drugs took hold. The narrative emphasized that this could happen to anyone in any community, regardless of choices or character. This compassion was real, but it was also revealing, because the addiction was the same, the suffering was the same, the desperation, the crime committed to feed the habit, the families destroyed, all of it was identical to what had happened during the crack epidemic 30 years earlier. The only difference was the skin color of the victims. When Black and Latino communities were ravaged by crack, the response was militarized policing, mandatory minimum sentences, mass incarceration. When white suburban communities were ravaged by heroin, the response was treatment funding, Good Samaritan laws to protect people who called 911 during an overdose, widespread distribution of Narcan, a medication that reverses opioid overdoses and saves lives. The Obama administration invested in treatment programs, expanded access to medication-assisted therapy, framed addiction as a medical condition rather than a moral failure. These were the right policies. They should have been implemented decades earlier, but they were not implemented for everyone. They were implemented when the crisis reached white America. The double standard was undeniable. It was documented in policy papers, in sentencing data, in funding allocations. The same nation that had filled prisons with black drug offenders in the 1980s now spoke of white opioid users with empathy and urgency. This was not theoretical injustice. This was measurable, quantifiable, systematic racism embedded in drug policy. And while the response slowly shifted towards treatment rather than punishment, while Narcan kits were distributed and detox facilities opened, the crisis continued to metastasize. Because the underlying economics had not changed, there was still enormous profit in addiction.
The cartels were still innovating, still seeking competitive advantage in an unregulated market. Heroin had returned to America, not as it had been in the 1970s, but transformed, cheaper, purer, more accessible. It had moved from the margins to the mainstream, from urban neighborhoods to rural counties, from stigmatized addiction to national emergency. But heroin wasn't the end. Cartels found something even more profitable, even more deadly. How did we get here? The answer requires looking at who profited. But first, we must confront what came next, the fourth wave, the White Death. In 1960, in a laboratory in Belgium, a chemist named Paul Janssen synthesized a new molecule. He was searching for a powerful analgesic, something that could manage the most severe pain imaginable. What he created was fentanyl.
Synthetic opioid so potent, so efficient at binding to the brain's opioid receptors that it made morphine look weak by comparison. 50 times stronger than heroin, 100 times stronger than morphine. This was not a plant extract. This was not something that grew in a field. This was pure chemistry, precision, control. For decades, fentanyl existed in the controlled environment of hospitals. It was used during surgery, administered by anesthesiologists who understood its power. It was prescribed for terminal cancer patients, delivered through slow-release patches that provided relief in the final stages of life. In this context, fentanyl was a mercy, a tool that reduced suffering when nothing else could. It was regulated, measured, monitored. It stayed in its lane. Then, in the 2010s, everything changed. Clandestine laboratories in China discovered they could synthesize fentanyl cheaply. The precursor chemicals were legal, easy to obtain, and the process was straightforward for anyone with basic chemistry knowledge. They began producing fentanyl in massive quantities, not for medical use, for profit. They shipped it directly to the United States, or more commonly, they shipped the precursor chemicals to Mexico, where the cartels had the infrastructure, the networks, and the ruthlessness to turn raw materials into a flood of product. The Mexican cartels saw an opportunity. Fentanyl was cheaper to produce than heroin. No poppy fields to maintain, no seasonal harvest, no need for vast rural operations that could be spotted from the air. Just labs, chemists, and chemistry. They could produce it in smaller spaces, with less risk and far greater profit margins. And because fentanyl was so potent, a small amount went a very long way. 1 kilogram of fentanyl could be cut into heroin and create thousands of doses. But there was a problem, a lethal problem. The difference between a dose that produces euphoria and a dose that stops your breathing is razor thin. 2 milligrams. That is the size of 10 grains of salt. Hold that image in your mind. 10 grains of salt scattered on a black surface. That is enough to kill you. There is no room for error, no margin for miscalculation. And the people pressing pills in cartel labs, the people cutting heroin with fentanyl powder, they were not pharmacists. They were not measuring with precision instruments. They were mixing in bulk, pressing thousands of pills, packaging product as fast as possible. The result was catastrophic. Users who thought they were buying heroin were getting fentanyl. Users who thought they were buying oxycodone were getting fentanyl pressed into counterfeit pills that looked identical to the real thing. They took their usual dose, and they stopped breathing. Often they were alone. By the time someone found them, it was too late. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In 2013, about 3,000 Americans died from fentanyl-related overdoses. By 2017, that number had surged to 28,000. By 2021, it reached 71,000. In 2022, over 73,000 Americans died from fentanyl poisoning. That is more than 200 people every single day. More than car accidents, more than gun violence. Every day, the equivalent of a fully loaded passenger plane crashing with no survivors. And this continued, day after day, week after week. By 2021, according to the Centers for Disease Control, fentanyl was involved in 67% of all overdose deaths in the United States. It had become the dominant killer, and it was not staying contained to heroin users. Fentanyl began appearing in everything: counterfeit Xanax pills sold on social media, fake Percocet, fake Adderall. Teenagers buying what they thought were prescription pills from dealers on Snapchat were dying from fentanyl poisoning. They were not opioid addicts. They were not seasoned drug users. They were kids experimenting, taking what they believed was a relatively safe pharmaceutical. 1 pill, 1 time, and they were gone. Even cocaine was contaminated. Methamphetamine was laced with it. People who had never touched opioids in their lives, who were using stimulants, were suddenly overdosing on fentanyl. The theory is cross-contamination in labs and cutting houses, or deliberate adulteration to increase addictiveness. The result is the same: unpredictability, Russian roulette in powder form. Public health systems scrambled to respond. Narcan, the brand name for naloxone, became ubiquitous. This opioid antagonist can reverse an overdose if administered in time.
It was distributed to first responders, made available without prescription in pharmacies, handed out by harm reduction organizations. Thousands of lives were saved. People were revived in gas station bathrooms, in parks, in their own bedrooms. But Narcan could not keep pace with the scale of the crisis. Harm reduction strategies expanded. Some cities opened supervised injection sites, places where people could use drugs under medical supervision, where overdoses
could be immediately treated. Fentanyl test strips were distributed, allowing users to check their drugs before consuming them. Campaigns urged people to never use alone, to have someone nearby who could call for help. These measures saved lives, but the deaths kept rising. Because the supply kept coming. The fentanyl kept flooding in. For every shipment seized at the border, 10 more got through. For every lab shut down in China, another opened. The economics were too favorable, the demand too inelastic, and the people dying were, in the eyes of policymakers and much of the public, expendable. Addicts, junkies, people who made bad choices. But that narrative was becoming harder to maintain, because the dead included college students, construction workers, nurses, veterans, people with jobs, families, futures, people who took one pill at a party, people whose prescription ran out and who turned to street pills because they could not afford a doctor. The demographics of overdose were expanding, and the deaths were becoming impossible to ignore. Yet the crisis continued. Over 110,000 Americans died from drug overdoses in 2022, the majority from fentanyl. There is no end in sight, no comprehensive federal response, no international agreement that has stemmed the flow. The White Death is not a historical phenomenon. It is happening now, today. As you listen to this, someone is dying. This is the fourth wave of the opioid epidemic, and it is the deadliest. The substance at the center is not a plant that grows in a field. It is a molecule designed in a lab, weaponized by economics, distributed by cartels, and killing at a scale that dwarfs every previous drug crisis in American history. How did we get here? The answer requires looking at who profited, who enabled, and who looked away while the bodies piled up. But the Sacklers weren't alone. An entire system enabled this. Yet before we examine that system, we must name the architects, the family whose decisions, whose greed, whose calculated indifference set this catastrophe in motion. The Sackler name. For decades, it was synonymous with culture, philanthropy, refinement. Walk through the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and you would find the Sackler Wing, housing the Temple of Dendor. Visit the Louvre in Paris, the name appeared on gallery walls. The Smithsonian in Washington, the Guggenheim, Harvard, Oxford. Everywhere the elite gathered to celebrate human achievement, the Sackler name was etched in marble, engraved on plaques, spoken with reverence. But that name was built on blood money. The story begins with three brothers, Arthur, Mortimer, and Raymond Sackler. Sons of Jewish immigrants in Brooklyn, they worked their way through medical school during the Depression. In 1952, Mortimer and Raymond purchased a small pharmaceutical company called Purdue Frederick. Arthur, the eldest and most brilliant, remained a psychiatrist, but pioneered something darker. In the 1950s and 1960s, he revolutionized pharmaceutical marketing. Before Arthur Sackler, drug companies produced medicine and doctors prescribed what they thought was best. Arthur changed the game. He created aggressive advertising campaigns aimed directly at physicians. He understood that if you could convince doctors that a drug was essential, you could print money. His techniques became the blueprint for the entire industry. He made a fortune selling Valium and Librium, tranquilizers that would themselves become subjects of addiction crises. Arthur died in 1987 before OxyContin was developed. His brothers inherited his methods. In the 1990s, Raymond's son Richard Sackler rose to power within Purdue Pharma. He was not a detached executive. He was intimately involved in OxyContin's development and marketing. Internal emails later revealed through litigation show Richard personally pushing aggressive sales strategies. When the company faced early reports of addiction and abuse, Richard did not pull back. He doubled down. In a 2001 email, as overdose deaths were beginning to climb, Richard suggested that the company should blame the victims. "We have to hammer on the abusers in every way possible," he wrote. "They are the culprits and the problem." The abusers, not the company that had lied about addiction risk, not the drug that was 50% stronger than morphine. The victims were the problem. The Sackler family was not a passive investor board. They ran Purdue Pharma. They approved the marketing lies. They set the sales quotas. They knew. Documents prove they knew. And as the crisis metastasized, as the overdoses multiplied, as entire communities were hollowed out by addiction, the Sacklers did something extraordinary. They looted their own company. Between 2008 and 2018, as the lawsuits began to pile up, as the legal walls began to close in, the Sackler family transferred between $10 and $12 billion from Purdue Pharma into personal accounts, trusts, and offshore holdings.
Switzerland, the Channel Islands, places where money could disappear into legal structures so complex that recovery would be nearly impossible. They saw the reckoning coming, and they moved the money. By 2019, Purdue Pharma faced more than 3,000 lawsuits from states, counties, cities, tribes, and families. The evidence was overwhelming. The company could not survive, so Purdue declared bankruptcy. And the Sacklers proposed a deal. They would pay $4.5 billion into a settlement fund. In exchange, they would retain their remaining billions, admit no wrongdoing, and receive immunity from all current and future civil litigation. They would walk away, still rich, still free, still protected. The courts approved it. There was outrage. Protesters descended on museums. They unfurled banners reading "Shame on Sackler" inside the galleries that bore the family name. Artists and activists demanded that institutions remove the Sackler name from their walls. Some did. The Tate Museums in London scrubbed the name. The Louvre removed it. But others resisted. The money had already been spent. The wings had already been built. And perhaps for some, the glitter of philanthropy still obscured the blood beneath. Not a single member of the Sackler family has been criminally charged. Not Richard. Not the others who served on Purdue's board. They have given depositions, appeared in civil proceedings, released carefully worded statements expressing sympathy for those affected by the opioid crisis. But they have not been handcuffed. They have not stood trial. They have not been held accountable in the way that the hundreds of thousands of people who became addicted to their product were held accountable. Over 500,000 Americans are dead. Millions more live with addiction. Families are destroyed. Children are orphaned. Communities are gutted. And the Sacklers remain billionaires. This is what impunity looks like. This is what happens when wealth insulates you from consequence. The system that allowed OxyContin to be marketed as safe, that allowed Purdue Pharma to continue operating for years after the dangers were known, that allowed the Sacklers to extract billions while people died, that system did not fail. It worked exactly as designed. It protected power. It protected money. And it allowed a family to build monuments to themselves with the proceeds of a national catastrophe. But the Sacklers weren't alone. An entire system enabled this. While corporations profited, communities tried to survive. But before we reach those communities, we must understand how the poison spread so efficiently. The Sacklers designed the weapon, but they did not distribute it alone. An entire infrastructure enabled the catastrophe. Pharmacies, distributors, regulators, lawmakers, each played a role. Each looked away. Consider the drug distributors. 3 corporations dominated the American pharmaceutical supply chain: McKesson, Cardinal Health, and AmerisourceBergen. Their job was straightforward: receive orders from pharmacies and ship medications. But these were not simple logistics companies. They were required by law to monitor their shipments, to identify suspicious orders, to report anomalies to the Drug Enforcement Administration. They had sophisticated algorithms designed to detect when a pharmacy was ordering unusual quantities of controlled substances. The algorithms worked. They flagged thousands of suspicious orders. Small pharmacies in rural towns ordering enough opioids to supply a city. Independent pharmacies with no hospital affiliation requesting millions of pills. The red flags were everywhere. The distributors shipped the pills anyway. Between 2006 and 2012, these 3 companies distributed over 76 billion oxycodone and hydrocodone pills across the United States. In West Virginia, a state with a population of just 1.8 million people, 780 million opioid pills arrived in a 6-year span. That is 433 pills for every man, woman, and child in the state. The town of Kermit, West Virginia, population 392, received nearly 9 million hydrocodone pills in 2 years from a single distributor. The math was impossible to ignore, yet the shipments continued. When questioned later, when the lawsuits came, the distributors claimed they were merely filling legitimate orders from licensed pharmacies.
They had no way of knowing the pills were being diverted or abused. This was a lie. Their own internal reports documented the problem. Employees raised concerns. Compliance officers warned executives. And still, the pills flowed. Then there were the pharmacies. CVS, Walgreens, Rite Aid, and countless independent pharmacies across the country. Pharmacists are trained professionals. They are legally and ethically required to refuse to fill prescriptions they believe are fraudulent or inappropriate. A patient showing up every week with a script for 120 OxyContin from a doctor 2 hours away. A customer paying cash, no insurance, for high-dose
Opioids. Multiple people from the same address getting identical prescriptions from the same doctor on the same day. These were obvious red flags. Many pharmacists filled the prescriptions anyway, because each script represented revenue. Each bottle of pills was profit. Corporate headquarters set sales targets and monitored metrics. Pharmacists who refused too many prescriptions faced questions from management. The incentive structure was clear. Fill the scripts, make the money, look away. The regulators failed just as completely. The Food and Drug Administration approved OxyContin in 1995 based on minimal evidence of its safety for long-term use. The claim that it was less addictive than other opioids rested largely on a single paragraph in a medical journal and studies funded by Purdue itself. Once approved, the FDA conducted virtually no post-market surveillance. As reports of addiction and overdose accumulated, the agency did nothing substantive to restrict access or require stronger warnings until it was far too late. The Drug Enforcement Administration, the agency tasked with combating drug trafficking and diversion, was underfunded and outmatched. The pharmaceutical industry spent hundreds of millions of dollars on lobbying. They hired former DEA administrators. They cultivated relationships with members of Congress. When the DEA attempted to crack down on suspicious distributors, the industry pushed back. In 2016, Congress passed the Ensuring Patient Access and Effective Drug Enforcement Act. The title sounded reasonable. The effect was devastating. The law, written with significant input from pharmaceutical industry lobbyists, made it nearly impossible for the DEA to freeze suspicious drug shipments. It raised the legal standard for enforcement actions so high that the agency was effectively neutered. The bill passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. Many of the lawmakers who voted for it had received campaign contributions from pharmaceutical companies. State medical boards, responsible for licensing and disciplining physicians, moved glacially. Doctors running pill mills, seeing hundreds of patients per day, writing prescriptions with no medical justification, operated for years before their licenses were revoked. Some were never disciplined at all. The boards were understaffed, underfunded, and in some cases captured by the very profession they were supposed to regulate. Even insurance companies played a role. Pills were cheap, physical therapy was expensive, surgery was expensive. Long-term pain management through non-pharmaceutical means required time, multiple appointments, sustained investment. Insurance companies made coverage decisions based on short-term cost analysis, approve the opioid prescription, deny the alternative treatments. It was cheaper in the first quarter. That the patient might become addicted, might overdose, might require years of expensive emergency care later, that was a future quarter's problem. Every link in the chain made the same calculation. Profit now, consequences later. The system was not broken. It was functioning exactly as designed to extract maximum revenue from human suffering, designed to diffuse responsibility so completely that no single actor could be held fully accountable. Purdue Pharma created OxyContin, but the entire pharmaceutical industry, the entire regulatory apparatus, the entire political system enabled its spread. Millions of pills into communities that had no medical need for them, and when people started dying, the enablers did not stop. They continued shipping, prescribing, approving, lobbying, profiting. While corporations profited, communities tried to survive. Some places gave up trying to punish their way out. They tried something radical. But before we reach those experiments, we need to understand who demanded change. Not politicians, not corporations, not the institutions that enabled the crisis. The mothers, the fathers, the families who buried their children and refused to be silent. They organized. Parents who had lost sons and daughters to overdose formed advocacy groups with names like Fed Up Coalition and GRASP, Grief Recovery After a Substance Passing. They were not policy experts. They were not lawyers. They were people who had watched their children die and decided that silence was complicity. They lobbied legislators. They protested outside Purdue Pharma headquarters. They testified at hearings, holding photographs of the dead, forcing lawmakers to look at faces instead of statistics. They demanded accountability. They sued pharmaceutical companies. They pushed for Narcan access. They refused to let their children be dismissed as junkies who made bad choices. Because the narrative was changing, slowly, painfully, but changing.
For years, the media had portrayed opioid addiction as a problem of moral failure. Addicts were weak, they made choices, they deserved what happened to them. But as the crisis spread,
beyond urban centers, beyond marginalized communities, into suburbs and small towns, the victims became harder to dismiss. High school athletes who got injured and were prescribed OxyContin, honor students who experimented at a party and ended up addicted, parents who had surgery and never stopped taking the pills. These were not the stereotypical drug users that policy had been designed to punish. They were someone's child, someone's neighbor, someone you knew. The humanization was incomplete, often hypocritical. When the victims were white and middle class, addiction was a disease. When they were Black or Latino, it had been a crime. But even an incomplete shift mattered. It created space for a different conversation, a conversation about treatment instead of incarceration, about harm reduction instead of punishment. Harm reduction. The concept was not new. Needle exchange programs had existed since the 1980s, created to combat the spread of HIV and hepatitis C among injection drug users. The logic was simple. If people are going to use drugs, give them clean needles so they don't share contaminated ones. Reduce the harm, save lives. But the idea faced fierce resistance. Critics called it enabling. They argued it sent the wrong message, that it condoned drug use. The activists countered that dead people cannot recover, that preventing disease was more important than making moral statements. By the 2010s, as the opioid crisis exploded, harm reduction strategies expanded. Narcan, the brand name for naloxone, became ubiquitous. This opioid antagonist could reverse an overdose in minutes. Administered as a nasal spray or injection, it blocked opioid receptors in the brain and restored breathing. It was a miracle drug. EMTs carried it, police officers carried it. Teachers, librarians, social workers were trained to use it. Parents kept it in medicine cabinets next to their children's insulin. By some estimates, Narcan distribution saved over 50,000 lives per year in the United States. Other interventions emerged. Never use alone hotlines, where people could call before injecting and a volunteer would stay on the line, ready to call 911 if the person stopped responding. Fentanyl test strips, distributed for free, allowed users to check their drugs for contamination before consuming them. Some cities, despite significant legal risk, opened supervised injection sites where people could use drugs under medical supervision, where overdoses could be immediately treated. These measures were controversial. They required accepting a reality that many people found intolerable, that addiction is a disease, that people will use drugs regardless of the law, that keeping them alive is more important than enforcing abstinence. In communities ravaged by the crisis, in Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Appalachia, grassroots mutual aid networks formed, neighbors helping neighbors, people in recovery supporting people still using, churches opening their doors not to condemn but to provide resources, free Narcan training, rides to treatment centers, non-judgmental spaces where people could ask for help without fear of arrest or shame. These were not government programs. These were ordinary people doing the work that institutions refused to do. They reframed addiction, not as moral failure, not as weakness, as a medical condition, as something that happens to human beings who are in pain, who were lied to, who trusted their doctors, who made one mistake and found themselves trapped in a chemical dependency they could not escape alone. The resistance was incomplete. Harm reduction remained controversial, underfunded, legally precarious. Stigma persisted. People still died. But the families who lost children, the activists who distributed Narcan, the volunteers who answered Never Use Alone hotlines, they saved lives. They refused to accept that death was inevitable. They fought with the only weapons they had, love, stubborn, relentless, inconvenient love. Some places gave up trying to punish their way out. They tried something radical. So where does that leave us, here, now, as the deaths continue? Before we answer that question, we need to look elsewhere, to a place that faced a crisis as severe as America's and chose a radically different path. Portugal, a small country on the western edge of Europe. In the 1990s, Portugal had the worst heroin epidemic on the continent. The numbers were staggering. By 1999, 1% of the entire population was addicted to heroin. HIV infection rates among injection drug users were the highest in Europe. Overdose deaths climbed relentlessly. The criminal justice system was overwhelmed. Prisons filled with low-level drug offenders. Nothing was working. The war on drugs, the punitive approach, the mass incarceration, it had failed completely. So Portugal tried something different. In 2001, the country passed Law 30/2000, decriminalizing the possession of all drugs, not legalization.
Decriminalization. Possession remained prohibited, but it was reclassified from a criminal offense to a civil one, like a parking ticket, like a health code violation. If police found someone with drugs, they confiscated them and issued a citation. The person was then referred to a commission for the dissuasion of drug addiction. These commissions were not courts. They were panels composed of 3 people: a doctor, a social worker, a lawyer. Their job was not to punish but to assess. They evaluated each individual's needs. Did this person have an addiction? Did they need treatment? Did they need job training, housing support, mental health services? The commission could recommend treatment programs, which were voluntary. They could impose fines, though these were rarely enforced if the person engaged with services. The focus was not on punishment. It was on reducing harm and supporting recovery. And crucially, Portugal invested. The money that had been spent on arresting, prosecuting, and incarcerating drug users was redirected into treatment centers, into harm reduction programs, into needle exchanges and supervised consumption spaces, into social services that address the underlying conditions that drive addiction: poverty, unemployment, trauma, isolation. 20 years later, the results are undeniable. HIV infections among people who inject drugs dropped by 95%. Overdose deaths in Portugal are among the lowest in the European Union, approximately 6 per million population. In the United States, by comparison, the rate is over 300 per million. Drug use rates in Portugal did not explode as critics had predicted. They remained stable. In some demographics, particularly among teenagers, drug use actually decreased. Incarceration for drug-related offenses plummeted, freeing resources and reducing the social devastation of mass imprisonment. Portugal did not eliminate drug use. That was never the goal. The goal was to reduce the harms associated with drug use: death, disease, crime, social marginalization. By those metrics, the policy succeeded beyond what most experts had thought possible. The lesson is clear. When you treat addiction as a health issue rather than a criminal issue, when you offer support instead of punishment, when you invest in treatment and harm reduction instead of prisons, people get better. Fewer people die, communities stabilize, the crisis becomes manageable. This is not theory. This is documented reality. 2 decades of data. International observers from around the world have studied Portugal's model. The evidence is overwhelming. Yet the United States refuses to learn from it. Why? The reasons are political and economic. The private prison industry profits from incarceration. Tough-on-crime rhetoric still wins elections in much of the country. Stigma around drug use remains deeply entrenched. Addiction is still seen by many Americans as a moral failure deserving punishment, not a medical condition requiring treatment. And perhaps most fundamentally, the American political system is resistant to radical change, even when the current approach is demonstrably killing over 100,000 people per year. Portugal proves that another path exists, that the deaths are not inevitable, that the crisis can be managed, the suffering reduced, the lives saved. But knowing a solution exists and implementing it are different things. Knowledge does not equal action. Evidence does not compel change. The United States has the information. It has the model. It has the proof. It chooses every day not to act. So where does that leave us here, now, as the deaths continue? So what is heroin, really? What is this flower we've spent 5,000 years loving and fearing? Before we answer that question, we need to confront where we are now. This moment, this year, the body's still accumulating. In 2022, more than 110,000 Americans died from drug overdoses. In 2023, the number held steady. In 2024, as you listen to this, the deaths continue. Over 75% of those deaths involve fentanyl. The 4th wave has not crested. It has not begun to recede. It has simply become the new normal, a permanent catastrophe that the country has learned to live with. American life expectancy is declining. This is extraordinary. In a wealthy, technologically advanced nation, people are dying younger than they did a decade ago. Drug overdoses are one of the leading causes, more than car accidents, more than gun violence. A generation is being lost, and the nation has normalized it. The fentanyl contamination continues to spread. It is no longer confined to the opioid supply. Cocaine is laced with it. Methamphetamine is cut with it. Counterfeit pills pressed to look like Xanax, Adderall, Percocet, all potentially contain lethal doses. Every transaction is a gamble. Every pill purchased outside a pharmacy is Russian roulette. And now there is something worse, xylazine, a veterinary tranquilizer never approved for human use, now being added to fentanyl by dealers. It is called tranq on the street. It prolongs the high, makes the supply go further, but it also causes necrotic wounds, horrific skin lesions that do not heal. And crucially, Narcan is less effective against xylazine overdoses. The one tool that had been saving thousands of lives is being rendered less useful. The dealers do not care. The users often do not know what they are taking, and they die. Yet there has been some progress. Harm reduction strategies, once marginalized and controversial, have gained acceptance. Narcan became available over-the-counter in pharmacies in 2023, no prescription required. It is being distributed widely by public health departments, community organizations, schools. Police officers carry it. Librarians carry it. Parents keep it in their homes. Lives are being saved every day. Medication-assisted treatment is expanding. Methadone and buprenorphine, medications that reduce cravings and allow people with opioid addiction to stabilize their lives, are more available than they were a decade ago. The evidence is overwhelming that these treatments work. They reduce overdose risk, improve quality of life, help people return to work and family. They are not perfect, they are not a cure, but they keep people alive. And alive is the prerequisite for everything else. There has been some accountability. After years of litigation, settlements exceeding $50 billion have been extracted from Purdue Pharma, Johnson & Johnson, the major drug distributors, and pharmacy chains. The money is being distributed to states and municipalities with the mandate to fund treatment and prevention. Some jurisdictions are using the funds responsibly, building treatment infrastructure, expanding access to care. Others are diverting the money to plug budget holes, funding programs unrelated to the crisis. The accountability is incomplete. The justice is partial. The Sacklers paid billions, but they kept billions. They admitted no wrongdoing. They received immunity from prosecution. Not one member of the family has been criminally charged. The executives who pushed OxyContin, who ignored the warnings, who prioritized profit over human life, they are not in prison. They are wealthy. They are comfortable. They are protected. And the system that enabled the crisis remains largely intact. Addiction is still treated by much of American society as a moral failure rather than a medical condition. People are still being incarcerated for drug possession. The prison system is still full of people whose crime was having an addiction. The war on drugs continues, despite decades of evidence that it does not work, that it causes more harm than it prevents. There has been no Portugal-style transformation, no national commitment to decriminalization and treatment, no fundamental reimagining of how America relates to drugs and addiction. The political will does not exist. The stigma remains too powerful. The industries that profit from punishment, from incarceration, from the status quo, they still have more influence than the families of the dead. Most Americans are one prescription away from potential addiction, one surgery, one injury, one bottle of pills prescribed by a trusted doctor. The conditions that created the crisis still exist. The pharmaceutical industry still markets aggressively. Doctors still prescribe opioids, though more cautiously than before. The supply chain that floods communities with pills still functions, and fentanyl continues to pour across the borders, produced in labs, shipped by cartels, distributed by dealers who operate with impunity because enforcement is scattershot and overwhelmed. The deaths are not inevitable. The crisis is not an act of nature. It is the result of choices, corporate choices, political choices, policy choices, and those choices continue to be made, every day, by people in positions of power who prioritize other values over human life. Over 200 Americans will die today from drug overdoses, tomorrow another 200, and the day after. This is the present reality, unresolved, unfinished, still killing. So what is heroin, really? What is this flower we've spent 5,000 years loving and fearing? Let us return to the beginning, to the flower itself. Papaver somniferum, the sleep-bringing poppy, a plant with delicate petals, white, pink, purple, red, and a bulbous seed pod that weeps a thick white latex when scored with a blade. Beautiful, simple, ancient. This plant has been humanity's companion for at least 5,000 years. Sumerians cultivated it, Egyptians prescribed it, Greek physicians knew its powers. For millennia, across every civilization that encountered it, the opium poppy served one essential purpose. It eased suffering. It allowed surgery before anesthesia existed. It granted sleep to the dying. It gave rest to those tormented by pain that had no other answer. The alkaloids it produces, morphine, codeine, thebaine, remain these
most effective pain relievers that nature has ever created. Nothing in all the vast pharmacopoeia of the plant kingdom matches what this single flower can do. The poppy is not evil. It is not demonic. It does not scheme or corrupt or betray. It is a plant. What happened? The empires built on addiction, the wars fought over trade routes, the epidemics that ravaged nations, that was us. Humans weaponized it.
The British Empire forced it upon China to correct a trade imbalance and extract silver. Purdue Pharma marketed it to American doctors with lies and incentives, creating an addiction crisis for profit. Cartels in Mexico refined it into heroin and fentanyl, building empires on the desperation of users. The plant didn't change. Our relationship to it did. Between 1999 and 2024, over 1 million Americans died from opioid overdoses. 1 million. That number is so vast it loses meaning, becomes abstract, a statistic in a report. But these were not numbers. They were people. Parents who kissed their children goodnight and never woke up. Teenagers who took a single pill at a party and stopped breathing. Veterans who survived war only to die alone in an apartment with a needle in their arm. Dreamers, artists, teachers, brothers, daughters, lovers, each one a universe of potential, extinguished. Their deaths were preventable. We know what works. Portugal decriminalized all drugs in 2001 and treated addiction as a health issue. Overdose deaths dropped. HIV infections plummeted. People recovered. Harm reduction strategies, supervised injection sites, needle exchanges, medication-assisted treatment, save lives everywhere they are implemented. The evidence is overwhelming. The data is clear. And yet we choose not to do it. We choose punishment over compassion. We choose stigma over treatment. We choose policies that we know will kill people, and then we act surprised when they do. This is not ignorance. This is a choice. Addiction is not moral failure. It is human vulnerability. It is the brain's response to trauma, to pain, to a world that has become unbearable. It is what happens when relief becomes need, when medicine becomes dependence, when the only escape from suffering is the substance that creates more suffering. The question before us is simple. Can we respond with compassion instead of cruelty? Can we see the person instead of the criminal? Can we offer treatment instead of a cage? Can we acknowledge that the war we have been fighting for over a century has failed catastrophically and choose a different path? The poppy still grows. In the mountains of Afghanistan, in the fields of Tasmania where it is cultivated legally for pharmaceutical morphine, in backyard gardens where people plant it for its beauty, unaware of the history it carries. It grows and it offers what it always offered: relief from pain, escape from suffering, sleep, dreams. The plant is indifferent to our wars, our policies, our tragedies. It simply exists, producing the same alkaloids it has produced for millions of years, long before humans walked the earth. We are the ones who decide what to do with it. We carry the history forward. Every death, every life destroyed by incarceration, every policy failure, every soul lost to an overdose that didn't have to happen, but also every life saved by naloxone, every person who found recovery, every moment of compassion offered instead of judgment. The poppy will still be here long after we are gone. The question is, what will we choose?